Hey everyone, how's it going? So we got our first real taste of difficult hardcore Nuzlocks with Gold, Silver, and Crystal. And I'm really excited to move on to Generation 3. There are a lot more moves, new mechanics like abilities, natures, EVs, and IVs, I think are going to make these runs a lot more interesting. We are going to be doing this in 3 parts. Today we're going to cover Ruby, Sapphire. We're then going to do a video on Fire Red and Leaf Green since they're pretty different from Red and Blue. And finally, we're going to cover Emerald version, which many consider to be more difficult, but since I've never done a single battle Emerald hardcore Nuzlocke, I can't speak to that as of yet. But like I said, today we're going to be talking about Ruby and Sapphire. Once again, as always, you can pause the video here to look at the hardcore Nuzlocke rules. They're pretty simple, and I go over them in more detail in the first video of the series, but assuming you've either paused, watched another video, or know what we're talking about, let's dive right in and talk about what starter we should pick. Now, my first run, I picked Torchic, and the reason I chose Torchic is because in Ruby and Sapphire, there are very few useful fighting and or fire Pokemon. There are 2 types, there just aren't many Pokemon of those types, and the ones that are easy to get aren't amazing. However, I will say that in my experience, the best starter to pick is Mudkip. Like with Totodile in Generation 2, the biggest advantage Mudkip has over the other 2 is that Mudkip breezes through the early game. Specifically, Roxanne is no issue with Water Gun, and Marshstomp's Mud Shot fairly easily will knock out Watson. Unfortunately, Torchic really struggles with Roxanne, and even against Watson's Steel Pokemon, there is a Voltorb that can use Self-Destruct, and that can be a huge problem for Combusken. And as for Grovyle or Trico, it's just not very good. Not great unique moves. Leaf Blade isn't as good in Generation 3. A very shallow move pool. Definitely by far the weakest of the 3 starter Pokemon. So I would really recommend Mudkip. As for other Pokemon I recommend, well, unlike Generation 2, in the early game, it's very difficult to guarantee Pokemon. You are very likely to run into Zigzagoon on Route 101, 102, or 103, Poochyena, and sometimes Wurmple. But on Route 102, there are some other options. In Ruby, you can get Seedot. I chose Sapphire because it won in a poll, and you can get Lotad. Both those Pokemon can be kind of useful, although Lotad is a lot more useful. I also happened to catch a Ralts in one of my runs. That run didn't go very far. The biggest problem with Ralts, and this is actually the biggest problem with a lot of the best Pokemon in Hoenn, is that they start off pathetically weak, and they get really strong by the end. Or they start off kind of strong, but by the end aren't as good. There aren't as many Pokemon that are just consistently good from beginning to end. Ralts/Kirlia is a prime example of that, and it takes so darn long for it to evolve to Gardevoir. You're in the very late game by the time that happened, and the truth is, you often need all your Pokemon to perform a function, especially if this is one of your first times doing a run like this. So what would I recommend ideally? Realistically, the only Pokemon you need from the early game would be Mudkip. But you really do want Pokemon like Tailo or Wurmple, simply because it increases the chance in Petalburg Woods you get a Shroomish. Now, Shroomish can help against Roxanne if you were to pick Torchic. You also can get Wingull, you also can get Lotad or Seedot, but realistically the best is Mudkip. Still, Shroomish will eventually become Breloom. And Breloom, like we talked about, not a lot of good fighting types. Breloom is a good fighting type. Unfortunately, it doesn't get a great fighting move until level 36, which takes a very long time to get to. In fact, Norman has a level cap below that, so you won't get to use Sky Uppercut, and you'd have to rely on Mach Punch. That's not ideal because in this game there are 2 slacking, and yet still it is one of the more usable Pokemon. Catching something like Tailo, Wingull, or heck, even a Wurmple evolving into Dustox or Beautifly will help with Brawly. Brawly, there's actually many options, but yeah, that's kind of the early game in a nutshell. Route 116 doesn't have anything super useful. I opted not to use Shedinja, even though I caught an Incada a couple times. I just think Shedinja is kind of cheap, And honestly, there really aren't any game-breaking Pokemon early in Ruby and Sapphire. The first opportunity to get something kind of game-breaking would be in Granite Cave. Now, Granite Cave has a lot of good Pokemon. Abra is a good Pokemon. I mean, we saw how good Kadabra is. Geodude and Graveler, we saw what they can do. But realistically, you'd want a Pokemon at level 12. You can buy Repels. And if you are playing Sapphire version, although Ruby you get Mawile, you can get either Sableye, which is far more useful, or Aeron. Now, the thing with Mawile is being pure steel, not great stats. It's not bad early game, but will be terrible. Sableye not having any weaknesses despite its very poor stats for a fully evolved Pokemon. It's really, really good. Unfortunately, I was never able to capture an Aeron. I got really, really, really unlucky. Now, Aggron has its issues, but being Steel Rock type, as long as you avoid fighting and ground moves, it can be extremely bulky. And you see, one of the biggest things in a hardcore Nuzlocke, because at this point it's important to talk about more general strategy, I mentioned roles a little bit earlier. One of the most important roles is, I believe, what they call a pivot. A Pokemon you can swap into to potentially save a Pokemon or for any other reason. So it's not just about having different type combinations, it's not just about having the perfect matchup offensively, it's about also having the perfect matchup defensively. Sableye's Ghost type and Dark type can help because a lot of Pokemon have normal moves and Psychic Pokemon do exist, but honestly, early game, Aggron would be super, super useful. In fact, it would completely obliterate Norman. So if you get one, I really recommend using it. However, if you get Sableye, well, Brawly can't do very much to you. The only thing I'll say, and this happened to me every time when I wasn't paying attention, watch out for the move Foresight. If a Pokemon uses Foresight, all the rest of the Pokemon can hit you with normal or fighting moves. You're a Dark type now. Fighting is super effective. Do not lose Sableye that way. I really, really don't recommend it. Now, a real run killer in Generation 3 is Watson. I mean, before we get to Watson, we actually have to talk about Mei2. But Mei2 in this game is far easier than she is in a speedrun or solo run. The biggest reason for this, assuming you took Mudkip, is that you should have a flying Pokemon to take on Grovyle, which realistically only uses weak grass moves. You should have your Marsh Stomp, assuming it hasn't fainted, which can take out Numel. And you probably have either Marsh Stomp, which is pretty good against Wailmer, or a grass or electric Pokemon like Electrike, which I really recommend using. And by simply timing your swaps appropriately, Mei2 is actually really easy. Watson, however, is difficult because of the Steel types and because of Self-Destruct. So if you don't have Breloom, and you don't have Marsh Stomp, and if you had, let's say, Trico, not really sure what you're going to do. Maybe you caught a Makuhita in Granite Cave, maybe you caught a Geodude, but there's not much you can do. Watson is actually unbelievably difficult, and the biggest reason I highly recommend new players like myself to choose Mudkip. It renders Watson from difficult to not a problem. Another trainer that is difficult but doesn't have its own level cap is Archie. Archie is tough, and the biggest reason is you have a Mightyena with Intimidate and then a Golbat that are very, very close to your level cap, actually. Depending how many wild encounters you have, you can actually be pretty close to the level cap, so you need to be smart. You need to use a special attacker against Mightyena or at least swap out. And that Golbat with Confuse Ray and Air Cutter can destroy you. I actually think Maxie is tougher because Camerupt is better than Sharpedo. It might be slower, but it is a lot bulkier. However, if you have Marsh Stomp still around, it should be easy. Speaking of having Marsh Stomp still around, if you do, Flannery's pretty easy. If you don't, not a problem. You can guarantee a Geodude encounter by on Route 115, the route just before Meteor Falls, there are rocks. You have access to Rock Smash. You need to go there in order to initiate the Mount Chimney part of the Team Magma / Team Aqua encounter. And so you can break rocks again and again till you get a Geodude, evolve it into Graveler, which, because I overleveled Marsh Stomp, is something I actually had to do. And although Graveler did faint, In this case, it did its job, and that's important sometimes. Sometimes Pokemon are literally only useful for one gym, and all it costs you is time to train them up. This is something we learned very well in Gold, Silver, Crystal, and we need to weigh how useful is a Pokemon for a specific gym, and how long does it take to level it up. In the early game, it's not the worst idea, as we saw, to have Pokemon that really do well. Remember our Graveler there? Remember Croconaw? They absolutely obliterated the early gyms and then weren't so useful. Graveler isn't needed, but can really help you, and had it survived, it can be super helpful against Norman. Now, Norman's kind of interesting. The level cap here is 33, and that means you don't have Swampert, you don't have Blaziken, but you could have a Mach Punch Breloom, you could have caught a Machop. There are options here. Depending on what your team is, one of two Pokemon can be tougher or neither. Slacking is the one you think would be tougher, but there are a couple Pokemon that just obliterate Slacking. One of them is Sableye, although the second Slacking does have Feint Attack, so you need to be a little careful. But two other Pokemon that can just annihilate Norman are Dustox and Pelipper. Pelipper and Dustox can both learn Protect, a lot of P's there, hope my pop filter was working, and Slacking's Truant doesn't care even if a move fails. So this is something to keep in mind. If you have a Pelipper, if you have Dustox, you win. There's nothing that Norman can do. Now, before you battle Norman, you can catch Trapinch, and this is a Pokemon that would obliterate Steven Stone. Unfortunately, never got to use Flygon. The level cap does not exceed 45 until after the 8th gym, and Vibrava and Trapinch are just so weak that merely trying to use them against random trainers had them getting knocked out at inopportune times. And that's the thing that really sucks. The trainers in Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald are much better than Gold, Silver, Crystal. They have far more highly leveled Pokemon with decent movesets, and so you really need Pokemon that aren't pathetically weak. And if they are, you need to use them at the right times. If you don't, you lose them, and that's why I could never get a Gardevoir, and it's why I never got Flygon as much as I would love it. That's another reason that Swampert works so well. Unfortunately, I never actually got a Swampert. I got some of the worst luck imaginable, and my Marshtomp would always faint before it became a Swampert. I don't believe I managed to get Swampert a single time, which is very frustrating, or maybe I got it just once. There are Pokemon, though, you can pivot to. So if Swampert faints, you can guarantee, if you used Repels and Meteor Falls, you can guarantee by using Super Rod, so you need to go to Moss Deep City, so after the whole Team Aqua, Team Magma stuff is resolved, or at least the second leg of that journey, you can get a Whiscash. It's basically discount Swampert, but it does the job and is good against Steven because of its water typing resisting steel and its ground typing having Earthquake. If you lose Breloom, in Ruby and Sapphire only, there is a pretty good chance you can get Meditite. You also could get Vulpix, which isn't so good, but Meditite or Medicham, Meditite's kind of weak. You should use Experience Share to level it up, but Medicham is bulky enough that it shouldn't faint unless you really give it a bad matchup. And don't let those base stats fool you. Pure Power doubles its attack. Not its base attack, its effective attack, which is actually even better. So it deals a truckload of damage. And yes, High Jump Kick is a little risky. However, you do get Brick Break in Cetopolis, which I usually replace High Jump Kick. So that will be your fighting Pokemon, which again helps against Steven and could help against Sydney. And by this point, once you make it past Watson, you should be thinking about the Elite Four. What am I going to use? That's the best way to do a hardcore Nuzlocke. What am I going to use for the gym leaders? But what do I need to beat the Elite Four? Are there Pokemon that it can accomplish a couple of those things? One Pokemon that's really good for the following gym leaders, but not necessarily for the Elite Four, is Magneton. Unfortunately, Magneton's a 50-50 shot in New Mauville. So that sucks. I don't have another way to say it. Magneton is pretty much better than Electrode in every way, but I would still recommend having an electric Pokemon to deal with Wallace. In fact, I would say the same thing in Emerald, except you would be using it the whole way through. In fact, if this were Emerald, I would have recommended using Lombre/Ludicolo because its water grass type is extremely good against Wallace as well. In this game, you can use Ludicolo. It does work. However, like in Gold, Silver, Crystal, I do think optimal Pokemon involve using at least 2 or 3 water types. So if I had my pick, by the way, because the next trainers we have are Winona, who's kind of tough, and Magneton makes it pretty easy. The only thing is, Altaria is annoying. Now, the best way to take down Altaria, although I don't recommend using it and never did, is a combo of Magneton and Gyarados. Because if you grind up enough money and give Gyarados Ice Beam, even though it's a terrible move on Gyarados, you will obliterate Altaria, and then Magneton can sweep the rest of the team. Of course, you can try to use other Pokemon, it's just tough, right? Pokemon you'd think like Graveler or Aggron, weak to Earthquake. There's the Tentacool line, but of course, they're also weak to Earthquake, although they hit much harder with Ice Beam. So, you do get access to Ice Beam, it's in the Abandoned Ship, but I did find Altaria with Earthquake a big challenge, and it is difficult to work around that. However, once you get past Winona, the next 2 gym leaders, the final gym leaders, are honestly 2 of the easiest. Kate and Liza are quite difficult in Emerald because they have 4 Pokemon, but in Ruby and Sapphire, it's just Lunatone and Solrock with worse moves. Literally, if you have 2 strong Pokemon with Surf, you might be able with crits to knock them out. Don't forget, in a double battle, Surf does 50% damage. That's kind of the way they avoid it being super cheap. But yeah, Tate and Liza aren't bad, and having an Electric or a Ludicolo for Wallace makes him a complete joke. So instead of talking about them that much, let's talk about the Pokemon you might want for the Elite Four. Now, the one last thing I want to add is that overall this run is pretty fun until the very end. You see, the level caps match up quite nicely with where a 6 Pokemon team typically would be right until you get past the 8th gym leader. The level cap absolutely spikes. And because Generation 3 movesets and AI is better than Generation 2, you really can't afford to be as under-leveled in this game. And so the best way I found to gain levels quickly, and I say that with a massive grain of salt, is by biking back and forth on the route just to the west of Mauville, where you have the daycare. There's actually not a straight line in Ruby Sapphire. I had no idea that was true. They changed it in Emerald. But regardless, sometimes after you've gone 500 steps and re-enter the route, you can talk to a trainer again and re-battle them up to 4 times. Now, the Versus Seeker in Fire and Leaf Green is a much better version of this in my opinion, but you will fight up many fully evolved Pokemon on this route. There are, I believe, 5 trainers. Well, the twins, I guess, are 2, but there are 5 trainers in Ruby Sapphire. 2 of them have 6 Pokemon each. But yeah, it's just bike 500 steps, go in and out, in and out, in and out. And it can take about an hour to get from about level 30s, late 30s, should be early 40s, or by the time you've beaten Wallace, to get to 55. Or heck, I just went to level 50, if you want me to be honest with you. I really think level 50 should be good enough, but it is the most unfortunate thing, and although this is not necessarily the intended playstyle, I do think the level caps make sense. You should probably be around the same level as your opponents. So the fact that this is such a massive spike does speak to a bit of a flaw in the game design, and the one really negative thing I'll say about this run. The Elite Four looks as follows. The level cap is 55. Steven's Pokemon, the final one, Metagross, is 58, but for the Elite Four, we can go as high as 55. We have to deal with the following trainers. We got Sydney, Dark-type trainer. There's Mightyena with Intimidate, gotta think about that. Phoebe, she's got Pressure Dusclops, kind of annoying, not much else. Glacia, Medicham, fighting type, that's fast enough, obliterates. Hariyama is slow, but Thick Fat makes it pretty easy. Drake, annihilated by ice types. And then Steven is a little more difficult. Even though he's technically steel type, Skarmory, Claydol, Armaldo, and Credilli, the 2 fossils, but most importantly, Metagross. A Metagross with Earthquake. We need to establish a team that can, maybe with a couple feints, but have the swap-ins to take on all of Steven's Pokemon and yet still be good for the rest of the Elite Four. So this is the type of team I thought would work. First off is our electric Pokemon, Manectric, preferably Magneton, or Electrode. You also have the chance in Safari Zone for a Raichu. I recommend this because although it doesn't directly help, it can be a good backup for Glacia. Her ace still is water type. These Pokemon tend to be fast, and it can be a good lead versus Skarmory, which can be very annoying to deal with. The other thing I recommend is specifically, and this is a Pokemon that's very easy to get, Walrein. All you need is to have caught a Zubat, and in the final section of the Team Aqua, the Seafloor Cavern they call it, the only Pokemon available are Zubat and Golbat. So you guarantee in Shoal Cave a Spheal. Now you can go for Snorunt / Glalie. I don't recommend it though. Why? It's just bulkier, Walrein. And against Steven Stone, Surf will come in handy. So I really recommend Walrein. So we have our electric type, we have our Walrein. I would recommend Sableye, but if you're playing Ruby version, Sableye might not be possible. Then I would recommend Absol. Absol's not a guaranteed encounter. You might find an Oddish on some of the routes before Route 120, and make sure not to talk to Steven and initiate the Kecleon encounter. Absol, even though its Dark-type moves are kind of bad, Swords Dance Shadow Ball can absolutely obliterate Phoebe, and it can be somewhat useful against even Metagross in a pinch. So I would really recommend Absol, Sableye, and maybe Dusclops or Banette, but not really because they're also weak to ghosts. No, my absolute fallback dark Pokemon would be Sharpedo. It has way better special attack than you think, and Sharpedo is one of those Pokemon because there is just so much water in Hoenn. With the Super Rod, you are almost guaranteed, no, you are guaranteed to catch a Sharpedo eventually. There's just too many repeats. There isn't enough diversity in Pokemon on the water routes. That's one of the worst parts of this hardcore Nuzlocke, is once you make it past Fortree City, there are no more land-based encounters. So we're really gonna need water types. And so in my final team, I had a Walrein, I had a Whiscash instead of a Swampert. We talked about Whiscash, and so that is another Pokemon, and we had Sharpedo. I also did use Medicham, but Hariyama is perfectly viable. Machoke, not so much. Don't recommend that a ton. But Blaziken, if you decide to go with Blaziken, very good spot to use it. And then finally, the final Pokemon I think you should use, not a guaranteed encounter, but one I highly recommend, is Altaria. Altaria can be acquired on Route 112. There are actually several routes you can get a Swablu. And Altaria, it just works. Sure, if you don't want to catch the Whiscash or you don't need Whiscash, you can try to get Bagon and Meteor Falls, but I didn't want to mess with that. A lot more luck-based, and then you have the stigma of using a pseudo-legendary Pokemon, which I've actually banned legendary Pokemon, but I prefer not to use pseudo-legendaries if I don't have to. Altaria does what Salamence would do, a little bit better. The moveset I like is Aerial Ace, Dragon Dance, Earthquake, and Ice Beam. Now, if you really need to, you might be able to set up a few Dragon Dances and potentially sweep, or you could just get off a quick Earthquake against Steven, maybe an Ice Beam. It can help against Drake. It can help against, heck, Sydney or Phoebe. Altaria is fairly bulky, great move coverage. It's just a great choice. And unsurprisingly, my final team took this form, with Electrode being the electric Pokemon. Instead of Sableye, it was Sharpedo. Instead of Swampert, it was Whiscash. And instead of Flygon, because I would recommend Flygon if you get one that far, it was Altaria. And I did manage to win. There are other Pokemon you can use like Ludicolo, but its biggest problem is it's a bit of a jack-of-all-trades, master of none, and that grass typing just doesn't help it enough. It creates a bit of a neutral matchup versus Glacia. I don't love Ludicolo. It's a lot better in Emerald version, to be sure, and something I really do want to use. But you might be wondering, why not use a fire Pokemon? Well, if you miss out on Meditite, I would recommend using Ninetales. Sunny Day, Solar Beam with a different Pokemon, Fire Blast, Overheat. Actually, I'd recommend Overheat over Fire Blast. Ninetales is a pretty solid Pokemon, but it's the only fire Pokemon other than Blaziken. If you want to go that route, I would recommend. Camerupt is fine, just too slow. And Metagross's Earthquake devastates it. It's just too slow. Macargo, same problem. Earthquake devastates it, too darn slow. Not a lot of good fire types. You would think they'd be super useful, but just could not find a use, and typically using a fire type just simply not worth it. It is funny that I have 2 straight runs where water Pokemon dominate, but the last time it's because Gold and Silver don't have the best balance. This time it's because the wild encounters have poor balance. And so I'm really excited to move on to Fire Red Leaf Green, but because I think they're going to be really easy, I do have a bit of a twist planned. But yeah, this took me only 5 attempts. My second farthest attempt made it all the way to Steven, and then Metagross took me out. That is devastating. You never want that to happen. But overall, while there were some annoying losses, if you just play a little cautiously, make sure you know your backups and what you want to do versus the Elite Four. Right now, assuming we consider Red to be the end of a hardcore Nuzlocke, I would say that Crystal is by far the hardest, followed by Sapphire/Ruby, and followed very distantly by Red and Blue. I've been told that Emerald is much, much tougher, so we will see. But until then, thank you for watching. Take care.